In this video, I'll discuss vulnerability remediation. It's one thing to identify vulnerabilities, but it's another to remove or mitigate that vulnerability. We address identified vulnerabilities ideally before malicious users do, and we might be required to do this for legal or regulatory compliance reasons. So ideally, we'll have an automated schedule by which we get vulnerability scan results so that we can identify these vulnerabilities. Manual remediation is possible. So for example, if we discover that remote desktop is enabled on crucial Windows servers and we don't want it enabled, then we could manually turn off remote desktop on each and every server that has that configuration. Of course, enterprise class tools will always have a way to automate this remediation. Now, it could also include things like missing software patches, security misconfigurations, even the detection of malware where we've configured it to automatically quarantine or remove the offending software. Vulnerability remediation allows us to prioritize our vulnerabilities. We can then determine the business impact if those vulnerabilities were to be exploited. So business process interruption, or it could even impact in a different way, such as by degrading IT system performance. Sandbox testing allows us to have a controlled environment to observe the effectiveness of a remediation. So when the IT technicians are testing vulnerability remediation, whether it be manual or automatic, this should be done in a controlled environment. Often, it's done in a virtualized environment, whether you've already got that available on premises on your own equipment, or whether you're doing it in the cloud where it takes only a few moments to spin up virtual machines to test things. When we implement remediation, we have to think about remediation inhibitors. Some inhibitors include cost. It might be too expensive to pay for the time for someone to get this configuration for auto remediation, for example, up and running. There's also complexities. Now, really, it's like anything that's worth doing. If you have the time to focus on something properly from the beginning, so to do it right the first time, really configuring auto remediation is not really that complex. Now, there are laws and regulations that might stipulate that we must enable auto remediation. As an example, consider a configuration baseline here in Microsoft System Center Configuration Manager. A baseline contains numerous settings. In this case, we're checking registry settings for a line of business app. Now, if I were to right-click on that configuration baseline, and if I were to choose Deploy to apply it to a collection of devices, one of the things I would notice is I have the option to remediate non-compliant settings when supported. So, for instance, if we've got specific settings for an application, and maybe those are simply registry entries, then we could auto-remediate that if it would make that application more secure, as an example. Now, to finish this example, I would have to specify a collection down here by clicking the Browse button of users or computers, in this case devices, where I want this done. So maybe I'll choose the All Systems collection. So we can deploy our configuration baseline with auto remediation to the devices of our choosing. On a larger network, it's a good idea to have some kind of central way to deploy remediations, even if that's in the form of updates, as opposed to going to each system one at a time. So we also need a way to track progress and run reports on either the success or failure of implementation of remediation solutions. So over time, we can also run reports or future scans to track the effectiveness of any fixes that have been remediated. And we can update organizational security policies or documentation, even that used by training for new user onboarding, as required. In this video, we discussed vulnerability remediation.